All right, I am Sarah Kirk. I'm the Provost and Dean of Faculty here at HWS, and I am so excited to have you all here. I'm excited to share in this event as we kick off our second annual Anderton Economic Policy Symposium. This forum provides an opportunity to host an expert in the field of economics so they can share their experience and insight with both our campus and the broader community. This symposium is made possible by Dr. Jim Anderton, a Hobart alum from the class of 1965, who is joining us here tonight. Dr. Anderton served on the Board of Trustees and is the founder and executive chairman of Crimson, a property management and real estate investment and development company. While at HWS, Dr. Anderton majored in economics. He's a longtime supporter of the colleges and has made generous gifts to his alma mater, including the Anderton Impact Challenge for scholarship and financial aid, and the Anderton 50th Reunion Cup to inspire giving among the 50th reunion classes. In addition to tonight's symposium, Dr. Anderton also created the Anderton Forum for Global Engagement, which we will be having our speaker out this spring. In 1997, he was awarded the Hobart Medal of Excellence, the Hobart Alumni Association's highest honor. In 2015, he received the Lifetime Service Award, which he presented to alumni who have made exceptional lifelong contributions to Hobart College. We are grateful to Dr. Anderton for his commitment to the colleges, and this evening, we especially appreciate his desire to foster vital and lively conversations in our classrooms, within campus forums, and throughout our community. I would now like to welcome Dr. Faisal Khan, Professor of Economics, to introduce tonight's distinguished guest.
Thank you, Sarah. Good evening, students, colleagues, and the wider HWS community. Thank you for coming out to our second annual Anderton Symposium. And thank you, Dr. Anderton, for making this all possible. And now, so Jim is in the audience tonight, so I'm not nervous or anything, but, hey. Right, so we are very lucky this evening to have an extremely distinguished macroeconomist as our speaker. Dr. Kartik Athreya is the EVP, Executive Vice President, and the head of research and head of the research and statistics group of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And for those of you who may not know much about the structure of the Fed, the New York Fed is by far the most important and in some ways the most powerful of the 12, it's a constituent banks that form our central bank. And so unsurprisingly, he is a very, very good, extremely accomplished macroeconomist. And, he's the author of this extremely well-regarded book, Big Ideas in Big Ideas on Macroeconomics. And I could go on and on about his publications and the journals that he has published in, right? You could talk about the Review of Financial Studies, the Review of Economic Dynamics, the Journal of Monetary Economics. And if you don't know much about economics, these names may not mean much to you. But believe me, I would give my eye teeth up to publish in them. So they are extremely, extremely well-regarded economics journals. And needless to say, the man knows macro. But as he's the chief economist of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, that's not surprising that he knows a heck of a lot about macroeconomics and monetary policy. But what I think sets Kartik aside, I think what sets him apart, and why we are so lucky to have him here, is that he's a little bit different from the usual kind of central banker, right? Where yes, you are expected to have extreme competence with macroeconomic policy, monetary policy, but Kartik's research also covers areas such as student loans, household financial distress, labor market disruptions, and the impact of incarceration on earnings, and the college graduate job prospects. And I think that's extremely interesting because most central bankers will be looking at the big picture. They're going to be looking at the forest. And sometimes they forget that there are trees in the forest, that there are families, small businesses, households, right? People whose lives are impacted by the big policy decisions made by central bankers. And it is really good to have people at the macro policy level who also are, concerned about what impact those policies have on the trees in the forest, the people, household firms. So, I think I've gone on, more than long enough with the introduction. So the last little thing that I want to say is that, Kartik is also extremely interested in the New York Fed's equitable growth indicators, because growth is good. Growth that is shared, spread out, is even better. So without further ado, since you're not here to listen to me, but to Kartik, I would like to invite Dr. Kartik Athreya to take the stage, please.
Thanks very much. Good evening, everyone. Faisal, Sarah, Jim, thank you so much together for creating this opportunity for me to speak with all of you. Faisal got me more interested in my own research agenda than I was 5 minutes ago, so I'm happy now. I think this is what perspective looks like in the world. Somebody tells you, hey, this is how your work fits in. I'm going to show you some slides a little bit. I don't think we should kill ourselves trying to get through all of them if we want to get onto other things. But I also want to give some space to Q&A because I feel like it would be good to hear from all of you, your students that are coming from various parts of education. You may be interested in all kinds of things. Some of them I understand, some of them I won't understand at all. But I think having a little bit of discussion with you would be a big part of what I want to get out of this evening. So what I want to do in my prepared remarks is just to talk a little bit about what we've experienced as an economy in the US, and as it turns out in other parts of the world too, with respect to what's called disinflation. Right away, just a jargon alert, that just means lowering the inflation rate. It's not the same thing as deflation because it can still be a positive inflation rate, just not as big as it was before. And if you remember the last few years, we've had inflation and now we're reducing it to some still positive but smaller number, okay? So if we look just to get a little bit of perspective over time, you can look at various measures of inflation. I've just picked a couple here for the US and for the Euro area. You really get in different parts of the Euro area, and you end up getting a similar picture. The timing is not identical, but you end up seeing inflation happen in pretty much all parts of the world, especially all economies that are broadly constructed like the US, broadly market-oriented economies. The mileage may vary a little bit here and there, but they're similar, more similar than they are different. And yet inflation, after being low for a very long time, and in fact, if I took this series way back, you would see it hugging 2% for a really long time across the globe, really, across the advanced economies. And then all of a sudden, it kind of got out. Okay, and it got out to levels that we hadn't seen for a long time. So the challenge, obviously, for any central banking system that wants not to have inflation be high and certainly doesn't want to have it be variable, that's very disorienting for anybody. Ask people that have lived in high inflation, high variable inflation countries. Some of you may be students from those kinds of places. That's a very difficult thing to kind of manage through in your lives. So central banks, having made a commitment to making sure that prices would generally stay stable, will have to act. So the question is, they want to disinflate. Now, historically, the disinflation process was seen as something costly or something that had to go with a lot of cost. So really, the TLDR version of it is, if you want to get inflation down, you've got to slow real economic activity down kind of dramatically. What does slowing real economic activity down mean? Again, going back to Faisal's point about households, at the household level, it means potentially putting people out of work as corporations and businesses of all sizes and shapes slow down their level of economic activity, right? So it's a fact of life that in the US and everywhere else, changes or reductions in economic activity happen in an extremely uneven way. They don't happen where 10% of everybody, they don't happen where everybody works about 10% less than they used to, right? So an example would be that's like taking Friday afternoon off. That's not a national catastrophe if that happens. But unfortunately, the way economies slow down in the whole world is that about 10% of the people have no job at all, and about 90% kind of carry on like they did before. They may be more worried, but they kind of carry on. So that's like a brutal way that most modern economies adjust to in their, when you see the scale of their activity change. Okay, that's a basic fact. So central banks are worried a lot about saying, are we going to generate a lot of unemployment? Because that's the way in which slowdowns in activity end up showing up. Okay, that's sort of a fact of life in any central banker's mind. In the past, there was a bitter experience with this. Now, this is something that, I'm talking to the students now. There's no chance, I think, that any of you really were around in the late 70s or early 80s. There might be. People can come back to school. But if you were there, you would know that that was a period of very high inflation. So that, think of that blue line, that PCE line, that's a measure of inflation. It was high. And then you can see it sort of getting walked down. Bit by bit by bit. Let me see if the point, whoops, how about I do that? There we go. If the pointer works, like there we go, it's coming down over time. Well, that was actually really tough because look at the red line now. That's the unemployment rate. It hit 10%. Now for just a little bit of perspective, this is the Great Recession here. We didn't get to that place on the unemployment rate in the Great Recession, which was of course horrendous for a number of reasons. But that gives you a sense of scale for what that disinflation episode was ultimately responsible for. I mean, it was really hard to get inflation down. Now, the beautiful thing after that is that inflation went down and stayed down for a really long time. And that's this long period of quiet, right around 2%. And that's not an accident. That's what central banks around the world were going for, okay? So central banks now, let's flash forward to where we were a couple of years ago. They saw really high inflation. They had to deal with it. They had this one gargantuan data point, certainly, that said, if you want to get inflation down pretty dramatically, you're going to have to be careful. You're going to have to be careful because you might end up creating a lot of unemployment. So central bank said, okay, that's fine. We're going to take this on. We've had about 25 years of really good inflation control. We've gotten people to believe that we actually care a lot about inflation. And another thing that's really important is that we got the general public to believe that we saw inflation as a central banking problem. There was actually quite a bit of discussion up until then about why inflation was happening in a sustained way. Central banks sometimes would say it's us, sometimes they'd point to other things. That got obliterated. And eventually what happened was all central banks said, this is, in the long run, this is us. We have to handle it. So you can see the way we handle it is by hiking rates. So some of you may be in economics or finance-related areas, and you kind of have heard the Fed say, is the Fed going to hike rates? What does that mean? That means that is the Fed going to change short-term interest rates and make the commitment to keeping them higher in an effort to make sure that inflation expectations remain fixed, real interest rates go up, economic activity gets postponed or goes down. That's the name of the game. It's basically trying to get economic activity to be postponed a little bit and not happen everything all at once, I think to quote a movie, at the same time. So that's kind of the thing that you're trying to avoid with interest rate policy. So you can see here that in the US, we had starting in 2022, in March or so, there was a series of hikes in the interest rate that were very rapid. Now, I haven't shown you a longer run picture here, but this movement from, on the left-hand side, from roughly 0 all the way up to something like 5.5% at the top range, that's not something that we had seen before in such a quick amount of time. It happened very rapidly. So you might ask yourself, like, okay, that's very forthright action on inflation. You saw it in the euro area, you saw it elsewhere. Japan, I just put it here because Japan's a slightly different case for a number of reasons. So Japan didn't have the same problems at that time that the rest of the world did. So what came out of that? So obviously I'm papering over a million details, but what came out of it so far has been a very smart decline in inflation rates here and elsewhere in the world, okay? And what you end up getting is not much by way of trauma. So remember the slide I showed you about 5 minutes ago where you saw the unemployment rate in the US spike up to something like 10%. That didn't happen anywhere. In the Euro area or in the EU, you saw unemployment kind of hover. It would be hard to see interest rate hikes. If I just showed you the right-hand panel of these pictures, you wouldn't really see it. Output growth kind of chugged along reasonably. There was no collapse in it. So on the real side of the economy, stuff that's happening to people, the amount of stuff we're producing, the amount of people that are working, that's not, you didn't see action there, but you did see inflation go back down. Okay, so in that sense, it's sort of a remarkably positive set of things that have happened where inflation came back down, policy reacted forthrightly as it was expected to do if inflation were to go up, and we're kind of in a good spot. Now, I think we want to be careful, and I'm not going to be the source of the most famous last words, here for at least the rest of the evening, where I say it's all done. We don't know the future, but so far it looks good. Okay. And in particular, if you look at unemployment overall, you can see that in this episode, it's not that the overall unemployment rate stayed low because all of the adjustment that happened in the economy happened on the backs of a smaller group of people who lost work in large numbers versus not. So this is one cut at it. You can look at people that are recent graduates. Some of you guys are going to be in that group pretty soon. All workers is that gray line. In none of those lines do you see any particular, everything's doing the same thing. Okay, that's the only point that I want you to take away from this. It wasn't traumatic for one particular group relative to the others, which you might have actually worried about even more than just merely having unemployment go up, because unemployment rarely goes up evenly. So a rule of thumb for you guys is it kind of doubles for everybody in recessions, but a doubling doesn't mean the same thing if the unemployment rate in your group is 8%, like it is for some subgroups in the US population, versus 2% or 4%, which it is for other subgroups. This room is going to have really low unemployment rates in general if the future is anything like the past. If your unemployment rate doubles, you might go to 4 or 5%. That's very different than going to 10, 12, 15, because those are kind of things that wreck the entire fabric of neighborhoods that you live in and all that, all the other collateral damage that comes from it. So in this case, those things didn't happen. There are various measures of underemployment by looking at kind of how people are fitted to the jobs that they end up having as graduates. The only thing I want you to take away from this is that it's always the case that recent graduates are kind of more often not exactly in the right spot, which kind of makes sense because a big part of what labor markets do early in your careers, and this is hopefully not traumatic to hear, is it's a process of matching, but it's two-sided matching. It's matching on what do you want, what are you suited for, what do you like, and then the other side saying, what are you well matched to? Are you coming here and doing the things that we need you to do? So there's more churning early in people's careers, and then exactly as you might suspect, separations from jobs and stuff, that all starts going down as you advance in your career because you're better suited to wherever you end up being than you were before. Okay? This isn't true for everybody all the time, but it's a general tendency. So here you can see that underemployment is also not something that is obviously much worse now than before. If you look across the Second Federal Reserve District, I just want to show you that this has been a time of generalized recovery from the pandemic, where again, the fight against inflation is not visible in very traumatic ways here. You can look across the parts of the state and see, that of course some parts of the state have done systematically worse than other parts, but then those are things that I think have less to do with any near-term actions by the Fed and much more having to do with really longer-term characteristics of industries and technologies changing. The region's growth, again, similarly has been solid. There's not much to see here other than it's certainly a disinflation that has been achieved, again, not without something that is, without something that's being too traumatic. We do a lot of surveys at the New York Fed, so one of the things that we want to know is how business people see the world around them. This is a really important activity of all Federal Reserve banks, by the way. And the key is that business people put their money where their mouth is. They're looking around at the world. They're making decisions based on the environment that they perceive is coming at them. they often see things in their broader environment before we see them. So the way that we cope with that delay, but by the time something happens in the economy, it takes a while for data to be processed, to be put into a form that we think is reliable. Those are waiting times where things can change. At turning points, it's particularly important for us to be very connected to the community. That's kind of the basic premise of the regional Federal Reserve System that you have in the US. It's so that we can actually understand a lot better and a little more quickly what is actually happening. So a vivid example is, even in a case where people view the Fed as being too late, was during the housing crisis. Again, this is something that I think predates almost all of you here. We heard from our industry contacts and we heard from our community development teams that something very strange is happening in housing. The kinds of loans that people are getting look different than before. The kinds of transactions that people are entering into look different than before. Now you could say, but you guys didn't do too much about it, and I think there's blame to go around in that particular episode, but the key point is that it's really important for the Fed to always pay attention to what the private sector actually sees around us, because they'll often know a little bit ahead of us, especially on turning points. So we're looking all the time at these indexes of what are business leaders saying, what are manufacturing firms saying, what are services saying, service sector firms saying. So we're trying to get a decent read all the time about, are things falling off the table, or are they kind of business as usual, okay? Those things look okay right now too. So I've told you a story that so far has had a reasonably happy ending part. I hope that it's essentially over. I don't want to call it an ending yet. The question you should ask yourself, that certainly central bankers ask ourselves, is, and we think we have an answer. It's going to sound a little convenient, so wait for it. But I think I will defend it. Why wasn't disinflation worse? Okay, so how is it that rates went up the way they did? Inflation expectations didn't kind of move around very much. So the real interest rate, the inflation-adjusted interest rate, went up a lot. And yet we kind of glided so far to lower inflation when the time before that we had really high inflation, that in the 80s, that's not something that we managed to do. Okay, so that's kind of the way to think. I think that's a way to think about this. So in this case, a couple of important things. Private sector expectations never became what central bankers call unanchored. It's not that business people or other decision makers in the economy suddenly thought, you know, inflation might be 8% a year, 5 years from now, it might be 20%, it might be 3%, who knows? That's not actually the kind of thing that people were entertaining in their heads. People had a sense that sooner or later, this thing would be brought back to 2%. That's something they evidently believe. There's a million ways in which you can measure this. I think we do it in about 980,000 at the bank, so I don't pay attention to every one every day, but the bottom line is we spend a huge amount of time trying to discern where inflation expectations are going through surveys. That's the markets group at the New York Fed spends a lot of time talking to dealers and other people thinking about what's happening in the future. It's through surveys that we conduct in research. It's through market-based measures. People trade on their beliefs on inflation. So those of you who finance majors, one of the things about financial markets is that they encode beliefs that people have about the future. They're seen as more credible in many cases because, again, people are betting on them. So just like betting markets sometimes can be useful, this is exactly one of those cases where options trading can be used to extract the probabilities of various inflation outcomes in the future. So we pay attention to those things. All of those things told a story that in the intermediate term, 3, 5, 7 years, nobody really thought inflation was going to be out of the bag. This is a tremendous tailwind to work with. It's the product, we think, of a lot of effort in the preceding 30-odd years of saying, we're going to be responsible for inflation, we're going to deliver low and stable inflation. We did it. Everybody kind of understood that we were capable of it. Nobody doubted it, even in the face of high inflation. Okay, so this is a big deal. They also understood that conditions had changed in the real economy that might have required that the appropriate interest rate was actually quite different than before. So you'll remember this was a time where things like supply chain constraints were actually really severe, and actually for like the real economy became real. That's what COVID in some sense was. It's like the reality to the point where nobody could deny it. People were getting sick, people were dying, ships were not getting loaded, ships were not even able to cross and unload cargo. Like, this is as real as it gets. So a bunch of real stuff happened. People were stuck at home. Fiscal support came in. People were getting transfers, and so in order to have their lives not collapse under them when they couldn't work. All those things actually called for an interest rate stance that was different all by itself. That happened, and that's how I think about the 2021 and 22 response on our part. In the end, the expected real rates that guide real decisions of business people rose. Economic growth slowed, although not relative to perhaps what we might have expected. And the pressure on businesses and households started to abate in terms of, we worried, for example, that wages and prices could kind of feed off of each other. You could say, well, why do you want to raise? Because prices are rising. Why are prices rising? Well, businesses say, because I got to pay everybody more. You want to get away from that kind of a loop. And the way to do that is to make sure everybody believes you that 2% is, as you go further out, it's going to be 2%. So that gets everybody calibrated properly, both people asking for raises and both people in the business of giving or not giving them. So that's an expectational, this is all about managing expectations and then doing the things that are credible, that make you credible, that make your promises credible. These are 3 quotes. I won't read them all to you, but the bottom line is all of them say the same thing, more or less, which is it's our issue to deal with. We will deal with it. It will go away. And in every one of these cases, that is the message that you want to take away from this. Okay, so now I'm going to quickly pivot in the next few minutes to just talk about inflation. So not everybody here knows what inflation is. Inflation you could think of as an average of a bunch of price increases or decreases. We all buy lots and lots of things. Some of their prices go up, some of their prices go down all the time. Take an average of those things. That's the average price increase is what we call the inflation rate. Now, when it's an average, it means that there's stuff being averaged over. So this is the hardest part of the whole program. So I think that one made sense to everybody. What you weight those averages by is how big or important that is in how you spend your money. So some things are more important than other things. If pencils, I don't know, does anybody use pencils? So if pencils became really expensive, you might care. If they went up by 200%, you might care. It's not going to show up in U.S. inflation numbers. Because unless you're spending all your money on pencils, you're not even going to notice. It's like a teeny tiny part of your budget, right? If you're spending that much on pencils, we should talk because you probably need help. Now, you can do the same logic for everything. You can ask, whose basket of stuff are you talking about when you talk about inflation? That's a useful question to ask. You could talk about the kid who just buys pencils, so that's a strange person. You could talk about people who are white. You could talk about people who are black. You could talk about all people who are lower income, all people who are higher income. You get the idea, right? All these groups may tend to spend money differently. Often, it's often the case that as economists, you think, like, if I tell you something about your income and your income prospects, I can probably tell something about the way you spend your money, right? There are things that you guys have been taught about luxuries and necessities. As you get richer and richer and richer, the share of things like food go down, 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 right? It becomes a smaller and smaller piece of your budget. If you're relatively low income, food is a huge part of your budget. So food prices matter to you a lot more than to those of you who came from households that are really well off. You probably didn't notice. You might not even know how much things cost. So inflation is very tricky because it's very different potentially for different people. Okay? And that's, I think, really important. And here I'm just going to show you a couple of pictures about how the gap relative to the overall inflation rate, that's what the departure from zero means here, looks like over this period of high inflation for different people, different broad groups of people. Now, mind you, be careful. A broad group of people hides a lot of differences underneath the hood. So the group of all white people is not just one group. It's the group of white people with college degrees, without college degrees, who are young, who are old, and blah, blah, blah. So I've added up and smushed over all of those things. Same thing with other groups. But you can see here that you have this period of inflation was pretty tougher on some groups than on other groups based on the baskets that we at the New York Fed have looked at in terms of what it is that they're consuming. And there are surveys on consumers that actually help you understand how to do this, okay? So we're not going to spend all night talking about the nitty-gritty of those, but that's the thing I want you to take away. Here's one. Look at the right-hand side panel for a second and look at income. And you can look at the bottom 40% of the population in income at various points in time. Well, their inflation rate, initially it was a little lower than the US average inflation rate, the overall inflation rate for the population, but then it went up and it kind of stayed up. That's that gray line over there. Can you see that gray line? It's a little hard to see. But for other groups, it was lower and then it kind of retreated back to the average, right? So in some sense, if you were, this isn't the same human beings at different points in time. It's a series of snapshots of people. But you can see here that some groups experience the inflationary period a little less severely than others. Now, mind you, if you look at the minus 0.6 there, that means they experience, that group, those in the top 20% of income, experienced a 0.6 percentage point lower inflation rate than everybody else. It's not that they didn't experience inflation, they did, because the overall inflation rate, remember, was high that I showed you before. So instead of 7, maybe it was 6 for them. Instead of 6, it was 5 for them, okay? You get the point. So this is important, okay? Understanding kind of people's experiences differ. And this is why we care a lot about the thing that, Faisal, you brought up earlier, that the economy happens to people, so you should probably spend some time figuring out like what's happening to people. And that's, I think, a big part of what we try to spend time on. This is another cut at it, college versus not college. You can look at those two groups, and you can see here, you can look at that, and that sort of tells you another story of how one group has had a quite differentially severe experience over this period than another group. It's not, again, to minimize what's happening to the college-educated group, but it is saying that they didn't have the same hardship in this window as the other group. Okay, so another important data point, okay? So now I'm gonna stop because I wanna go through some Q&A and a discussion with you guys, but here's my free bonus material. So a question that you guys are always gonna be asked is, should I go to college? Should I go to college? College, what's so great about it anyway? Maybe you don't have to answer that question. Your parents may not have even asked you, I don't know. But in the end, like one of the things that college helps you do is it immunizes you against downturns. And that's been a feature across recessions. Those are those gray bars here. So the unemployment rate for everybody goes up, but it's lower and it jumps up by a lot less for one group than it does for the other groups. Okay, so that's like one of those things that seems to be true very generally, because this is a long period of time. This is like the last generation or so. So the general skills that you're learning here, I think, are actually doing something. That one interpretation of these data is that the generality of your training is actually allowing you to kind of swing from vine to vine as the world changes and get to the next thing in a way that you're not as specialized in something, which can do really well for a while, but if that thing goes away, then it's harder to switch into something else. Okay, this is actually a really important point to make whenever thinking about vocational versus college. And it's not, there's a really, really important point here that I want it not to be misconstrued on. In the end, a lot of this is about matching. The return to college for you depends on how much you get paid, but also on what you could have made if you did other things. That's the return for you personally. So if you're unbelievably good at carpentry, unbelievably good at spatial relations related to home building or welding or whatever it is, it's possible that for you the return to college is actually low. You might actually do really well in the other thing. So you have to ask yourself, as soon as you see data like this, don't go running off with it, but do some inquiry about who you are. And if you can't answer that question, then think some more, because the ultimate return question is a personal one. What is your return? And that depends on who you are. Okay, so that's an important pair of points that I want you to take away from this. You're like, you're not my dad. Why are you telling me this stuff? But I think it's important because these are kind of features of the U.S. economy that I think it's useful. The other thing to see is like what the distribution of earnings ends up looking like, okay? Now, I think if you've taken a labor economics class, you're gonna, again, there's a caution here. It doesn't mean that this is causally going to happen to you. It could be that the people selecting into these things were gonna do well no matter what they did, and instead they generally selected into college, okay? So that's, again, there's always this caveat that you should have in the back of your head. This isn't saying that it's college that's doing all the work. With all due respect to your fabulous instructors, some of it could be you're going to do well no matter what, so you got to be really careful about that. But it is the case that the distribution of earnings among those who have degrees tends to be shifted upward of the other group, okay? So I wanted to give you these two basic facts given where you might be in your lives. They both bear caution and neither bears snottiness. So I didn't want to convey anything like that in here, but it makes you have to think about who you are. So with that, I'm going to stop and we're going to do some, I think, moderated discussion and then Q&A with you guys. So thank you.
So just ask a couple of questions. One that there's an old joke that the job of an economist is to make astrologers look good. And so as a sort of part two of that is that your economists have predicted 7 of the last 3 recessions. Now, in one sense, that is actually good because if the central bank has really done its job well, you don't go into that recession. So let me put you a little bit on the spot, right? So as you pointed out, we've had an unbelievably soft landing. In fact, there may not even actually have been anything that you could really call a recession. So was that luck? Did all of the stars coincide? Or was that the unmatched skill of the Fed at managing things?
So I think the answer is always going to be luck helped. And there's no question about it. I think I told a story in which the central bankers were unusually good at their job. I think it's important to take this into account. The world has to cooperate a little bit. One thing about the first slide that I showed you with the inflation rate moving up and down, in some sense tells you that you got to have some luck on your side. The real events of that period in 2020 were not ones that any central bank actually was able to kind of leave with no inflation footprint. In the end, inflation did happen. So like right off the bat, I think there's an important caveat in the sense that you need the universe not to give you that kind of hand every once in a while. If you get that kind of hand, then you're going to have some inflation. And so the central bank in that sense is, I think, going to have almost an impossible time getting inflation to not happen in the wake of shocks like the ones that happened in 2020 and beyond. However, it's in the best possible position to get rid of that inflation painlessly if it always is understood to be on the ball with respect to wanting to deal with inflation should it ever break out. And so I view what we did as incredibly aggressive. That rate hike path that I showed you was really aggressive. Now, you might think you're going to break a bunch of stuff if you do that. And that would have been a reasonable thing to worry about. And I think it's precisely everybody thinking, why are those expectations anchored in the first place that I talked about earlier? They were anchored because I think the private sector broadly said, these guys actually mean it. If inflation goes up, they are going to prioritize it over everything else. And that's exactly what we did. And so I think in that sense, we were dealt a bad hand initially, but I think our work allowed us to get better. And then we didn't have subsequent bad luck that would have derailed the progress of disinflation. So I think there's no escaping luck somewhere.
That's okay. The second question that I had was that you've been talking about monetary policy, right? But, sort of it takes 2 hands to clap. So we've got, monetary policy, and then we've also got, fiscal policy, right? So how much kind of coordination can you have between monetary and fiscal policy? Because, you talked about the early 1980s, and which was an unmitigated, economic disaster. But in part, that was because you've got, fiscal policy moving in the opposite direction to monetary policy, or, maybe monetary policy was in response to an ultra-expansionary fiscal policy. So we've got massive budget deficits, right? Budget deficits are inherently inflationary, it's a ceteris paribus. So how do you see the Fed's, policy stance in the future, given that we are going to continue having large budget deficits, and that's fiscal policy?
So I think I'll be super careful in how I answer this question.
Yes, sir.
Because it's important, because I think this is good for everybody here to understand that the U.S. has carved out spheres for the Fed to operate in and talk about and opine on, and not to do that. And in one sense, it's really important for the Fed or the central bank in the US to not make judgments necessarily on the path of fiscal policy, because we see those as the province of congressional and executive branch deliberations about how to finance spending and how much to spend, right? So those are decisions that are happening outside of our walls. I'll speak for myself, the way I think about it as an advisor at a central bank is that's the world out there. You don't have to like it. Nobody asked you. Deal with it. And the way we deal with it is by thinking about making sure that monetary policy stays super focused on our mandate. And I think we may talk about that later at some point. But we have a goal. We have to maintain price stability, and we have to keep an eye on employment. But beyond that, we have to sort of almost think of. I think of fiscal policy sometimes as just like there are asteroids, there are things going around. I can't do anything about them. I deal with them when they get close, and then we try to do the best we can. That we stay in our lane that way.
Yeah. Fair enough, because the fiscal policy has absolutely nothing to do with the Fed, and that was, okay, somewhat unfair question to ask you.
I think it's a useful thing for people to know about, yeah.
To segue off your discussion of the mandates, right? I think since I know quite a few of you guys here, you all know that the Fed has a dual mandate, right? As you said, at the price stability and in the full employment. But de facto, isn't there also a third mandate, right? Going back to the Greenspan put, right, where it is financial market stability. So how does that factor in, and how kind of complicated, especially given the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, because Wall Street's in New York. Mm-hmm. So how does that factor into your decision making, given that you have a de facto third mandate?
So I think I would characterize it as a concern for financial stability. Certainly, is we pay attention very proximately because the Fed needs to implement monetary policy. It implements monetary policy through financial markets. So very specifically, we target interest rates. We're able to we have the stature in markets to determine really, really short-term interest rates pretty much at will. And the question is, how do you use that power? And that's monetary policy. But how do you make sure that your ability to set those short-term interest rates is actually not completely hindered? That hinges on financial market function more generally. So I think one of the key points of intersection for us with what's happening in financial markets is whenever we see something that we think is absolutely counter to allowing, let's say, the U.S. Treasury market to function smoothly, where suddenly people are unable to make trades even at all normally, and then you might get lots of interest rate spikes. For instance, that threatens the ability for us to say, this is what the short-term interest rate is going to be for a while. That becomes, if you want to think of it as that's a plumbing problem. Plumbing problems are severe problems in life, like in every sense of the term. I think we can all agree. So you don't want them. This is no different. So I think we have to pay attention to how financial markets are actually able to operate, especially the short-term ones. The Treasury repo market is one particular. That's a bit of jargon for some of you, but there's a specific market that we pay a lot of attention to because it's kind of central to the way that monetary policy can work. But beyond that, of course, we pay attention to things like catastrophic bank failures and so on, just to make sure that they don't have lots of collateral damage. So we've always been a lender of last resort. That is a fundamental part of central banking. So to some extent, I think of it as less us having a mandate for financial stability for its own sake than an eye to the parts of the financial markets that are important for implementation, and then the traditional discharge of the lender of last resort function.
All right, one last question, and then I will ask you guys if you have any questions, right? I tell my students, in macro, at the money in banking, etc., that the Fed basically saved the world, right? It helped save the world in the Great Recession, and then with regards to it's a COVID pandemic, yes, there was fiscal policy, but the Fed really saved the world. The cost of the Fed saving the world was this gigantic expansion in the Fed's balance sheet, where it goes from being under, 1 trillion back in, 2008, which seems like so long ago, to at its peak, it was just about 9 trillion.
Yeah.
Right. So is this the new normal where the Fed will have this massive balance sheet? Because it was unwinding it, but that has its own implications for your financial markets. So how is the Fed?
Yeah. So I'll answer the technical question at the end first, and then I'll go back to the broader issue. The Fed is committed to running what is called an ample regime for reserves. So what ample is going to mean is that the shocks that are hitting financial markets don't make a particular asset in the financial market known as reserves. Those are a liability that we issue. They don't make movements in that change rates very sharply up or down. So it can be shocks in that market. We don't want those to pass through to rates. That's what running an ample system means. Ample means, and that's going to be more reserves in perpetuity as a share of GDP or anything else than was before. Now let's go to the bigger issue. Why does the Fed have this big balance sheet to begin with? One of the reasons it has it is because of the financial crisis that came before. So one of the things that happens that that not just the Fed, but central banks, the whole world around had to deal with was, how can we make interest rates low enough and provide accommodation at a time when the world economy is struggling as much as it was during that financial crisis? One of the ways in which we do it normally is reduce interest rates. It's kind of hard for the US central bank, it's not something that we do, to lower that interest rate on interbank overnight loans to below zero. It can be done through institutional changes. The European Union found some ways to do it. But at any rate, you're not going to have particularly deeply negative rates be possible. One really basic reason why it's hard to have extremely negative interest rates in an economy is because most of us, and you may not use any of it anymore, have access to a zero interest rate asset that is cash. Okay, so if you have something that gives you zero, and let's say it were actually easy to store, or you could hire, there's an industry that would crop up to help you do custodial services of piles of paper money, then it's hard for a central bank to make the market interest rate on loans between banks below zero, because everybody has access to something that earns zero. That's called the zero lower bound or the effective lower bound. That's a problem for central banks trying to reduce interest rates enough in the face of really big crises. So what they tried to do, and by some measures with some success, is try to change interest rates that were at longer maturities that tend not to be as close to zero as short-term interest rates. And this is what they did, that by buying assets at higher and longer maturities. What did they do? How did they pay for that? Us, central bank, issues reserves. That ends up putting assets on your balance sheet. It means you issue a lot of liabilities. And the goal is basically to have accommodative monetary policy at a time when you're otherwise constrained. Now, there's debate within the economics profession as to whether this was actually effective. Some people say it was effective. Studies still haven't, I think, concluded that decisively that it actually made a huge difference. But the bottom line is that neither did it come to pass at all that you had sustained high inflation. And I certainly don't class the inflation that we saw during that COVID period or post-COVID period as having anything to do with the balance sheet, because we had a decade of low inflation after the pandemic with a humongous balance sheet. We figured out how to operate with a big balance sheet, and I think for me it's a matter of general indifference, and I think now we have an operating system that actually benefits a lot of parties by having a large balance sheet. So I think, it's not the kind of thing that fusses me, but I know that some people would like to see the Fed have a smaller balance sheet for a variety of reasons. I think there's a lot less action there than I think some people think.
I have a couple more, but they are the technical ones, which will bore the heck out of most of you guys. So I'm going to
Great, let's do it. I'm kidding.
Well, that's the job of economists, right? Haven't you seen Ben Stein in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, right? That scene where it's an economics class. All right. Maddie, would you mind, playing the host? Right. So if there are questions from the audience,
there's one in the.
Oh, there's one right there. Sorry. Thank you, Kartik.
Sure.
Yeah, so you mentioned the Fed acting as like the lender of last resort in recessions. And I was wondering if you had any concerns about kind of risk in the financial sector as the Fed continues to act as the lender of last resort, kind of as Minsky suggested.
So I think there's always risk associated with the possibility of rescue. And so I think there's no question that that's something that has to be done thoughtfully. I would never want to characterize it as like a freebie, that the rescue of an institution or the lending of last resort is always and everywhere a good idea. In fact, some people have pointed to Continental Illinois, which is a bank a long time ago, as being a really big switch flipping in terms of a lot of parties in the economy thinking that if we get kind of big and we're kind of interconnected with each other, then the central bank, in this case the Fed, because it could be anywhere, right? We'll be like, okay, we gotta help those guys out, and that's bad because up front they can start taking risks and then putting losses back ultimately on the broader society. So I think no responsible central banker that I know doesn't worry about the thing that you're talking about. I think it's a real thing. One of the ways in which we try to mitigate that is that through the formal lending that we do at the discount window, that's called that for some historical reasons, is that those are, people have to pledge collateral at the window, and that collateral, has to hopefully cover the losses. So in some sense, you're trying to lend against a bank that is solvent but illiquid, in the sense that they're good for it. If they had some time to dispose of their assets, they could pay their debts and so on. It's just they can't do it like this second because of a bunch of things. So we're the people that will say, we'll get you through this. So if you're doing lending to solvent but illiquid institutions, that has less of this problem. If you're doing it to institutions that are not solvent, that has a bigger problem because it could lead to a lot of other people taking risks. The catch is that knowing which of these things is happening in real time actually is really hard, because you actually lack, in many cases in a pinch, you'll lack market prices. When things become illiquid, part of the definition is you can't get rid of it and you can't get somebody to quote you a price for it. So you don't even know how much it's worth. So then if you don't know how much it's worth, it becomes much more complicated to figure out, is it solvent? Is it not solvent? Would it be solvent if there were a hypothetical auction that we could have? You go down that kind of pathway. So that's a long answer, but I think it's something to worry about.
So when we talked about inflation among different racial groups, I saw that inflation went up for Hispanics almost identically to the amount that it went down for Asian Americans, and I was wondering if this was a coincidence or like how this happens.
Yeah, no. So two things. One is that measure. I meant to be clear about that. It was like it's a gap in the sense that the additional inflation or the less than additional inflation that group suffered, that's what the deviations from zero was. But your point still holds. The second thing is, yes, I think that there's no reason to think that was anything but a coincidence, because it's coming off ultimately of the baskets that the two groups are consuming. They may not be the same. They may have just had price movements within the basket that added up to the average being mirror images of each other. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah, I think in the front here. Oh, I don't know.
Sorry.
Hi there, thank you for being here. Your studies about incarceration were mentioned briefly in the introduction. I just quickly wanted to ask you what you're most passionate that you learned from your research about that. Thanks.
So that's something that interested me, because if it was the case that incarceration spells were really life-changing events for earnings, then I think we want to know that as a society, just because the extent to which that paper tries to be very careful about saying that incarceration is causal. We don't do the work in that paper to establish that because incarceration, therefore this. It's a paper that documents very carefully an association between these two things. So for me, the thing going back to your question that got me interested in it is, I care about everything that I think matters for the U.S. economy in some first order way. And if it turns out, for instance, that incarceration changes people's earnings paths in a really sizable way, 25, 30, 40% forever, that is a really, really big thing. And there's no chance that doesn't have a bunch of other implications that span generations. There's no chance that it doesn't have implications that span the overall functioning of the U.S. labor market. So this was the first foray for me into that world, where I wanted to learn a little bit about the facts of of kind of what associations may be out there. So I'm being careful not to get out over my skis and draw too many conclusions about it, but that's what got me thinking about it. So I think and then the bigger point that I want to make is that I'm concerned, just like probably a lot of you, with where is potential being thrown away in the U.S. economy? That's like a really important question, because if potential is being thrown away, everybody loses, right? That's kind of what it means for potential to be lost. It's not, I can get you more and somebody else less. It just means everybody loses something that we could have all had. And that's bad. So a vivid example for me was when I worked at the Fed in Richmond. I would notice this when I would leave work. It was me and some people leaving. The only people coming in the other direction were African Americans, and they were all there to clean the building. It seemed almost impossible for me to believe that one of the people walking the other direction of me wasn't probably just as smart as me, just as go-getting, smarter. It just looked very hard to square with potential not being used in a society. That looks more like a misallocation. So that got me thinking about these kinds of problems. So it's a long answer, but I hope it gave you context. Yeah.
Maddie, I think Dave had a question.
It was mentioned in the introduction that you do a lot of research into student loans. I was wondering, recent rate hikes and more recently some cuts, how does that affect student loans? And then also, you're obviously an advocate for the importance of higher education in general. How do you think that we will see more or less people in college based on the cost of education and the cost of student loans?
Yeah, so, I think one of the things about student loans that is useful is there's a sense in which it forces you to think a little bit about whether you want to undertake this investment or not. And this goes back to the thing I said about know thyself and try to imagine yourself along different pathways, because that's really the calculation that you have to do when you make this decision. One of the things about debt, though, is that it has this power that it can concentrate your mind, because outside of debt forgiveness, you'll have to pay it back. Now, if you know that your debts will get forgiven, that can lead to distortions in the way that you make choices, without a doubt. But if you think that you have to pay it back, then you have to think a lot. Now, on the other hand, debt is scary, because if you have to pay it back, you have to pay it back, and you don't quite know what's going to happen in the future. So debt has very bad insurance properties, right? It has sharp incentive properties, bad insurance properties. And I think that's the trade-off that we're kind of wrestling with as a society when we think about under what conditions should you forgive debts. Now, so one kind of bit of economic logic here is, imagine that you only conditioned forgiveness on something in the aggregate economy being really bad. That can potentially get you some benefits, in the sense that going into it, you can say, yeah, I'm going to have to pay this back unless there's a recession. Well, I don't control whether there's a recession. No one of us does, right? So it's got the advantage of having something that can't be gamed in any way, but yet can provide the insurance should kind of things go, things fall through the floor. So I think right now, it's very hard for me kind of to make a blanket statement about student debt, because it's got these cross forces going on. And I don't want to opine too much on something that, again, it has lots of distributional implications that people care a lot, some people care a lot about. So I want to be careful. So I'll stop there.
I think we might have time for one, maybe two questions. So Nate, and then Hank.
Yeah, hi. I just want to return to something Professor Khan said about luck with regard to financial crises. And you said we get dealt bad hands all the time, but are there ways that the Fed can either anticipate, or measures they can take to anticipate crisis that will not result in completely getting blindsided by either a financial crisis or a health crisis like in 2020, that we can use to combat these either before they happen, or we can control it more when they do happen?
Yeah, so I think on the second part of those two things, that has happened to a great extent. So one of the things that came out of the financial crisis was a pretty large set of changes in liquidity testing on the part of banks, or the ability of banks and other institutions to unwind themselves if they needed to be unwound in a crisis. Those are all things that were aimed at mitigating damage once something happened, but they were also aimed in part at making sure that firms were more resilient to begin with, so that the same shock that happened, let's say Well, two things. One, imagine that you had the same kind of drop in house prices in nationwide indices that you had in 2007 and 8. There are two worlds. One in which banks were pretty well capitalized, households were not particularly levered up, they hadn't borrowed so much against the value of the house, et cetera, that wouldn't have given a really large group of people incentives to not repay all at the same time. It would also, so those are kind of rules that function, I think, in two ways. One is that they help prevent asset price run-ups that then are often associated with people borrowing like crazy to get in on the action while it's happening. So you want to not have a lot of that. Now, I think central banks around the world and financial stability authorities more generally in the Treasury and elsewhere have paid a lot of attention to trying to make sure that we have fewer incentives for those kinds of asset run-ups. One of the things you could, again, blame central banking for here, so to play in your favor, it's not always luck. If the central bank keeps rates unusually low for too long, that can actually cause a problem too. And in fact, some people look back at the 2001 to 2005 period as one where central banks actually contributed to creating conditions. Now, I think that's not a perfectly fair reading, but I think there's something to that too. So how we do interest rate policy now takes into account whether we're creating conditions for excessive leverage. There's an incredible amount of monitoring of the financial system that's going on right now to make sure that we try to see interconnections between firms, and we ask firms to actually help us understand how they would actually deal with various kinds of events through scenario planning. Capital regulations on the part of banks have been cranked up and up and up. Banks don't love this. There's a trade-off there that needs to be dealt with. But so that in many ways, there have been a ton of responses to actually prevent at least that from happening again. So in a way, the good news is that that's happened. The bad news is what you can then say is, well, that thing won't get us, again. Some other thing might get you. And the history of business cycles in the world is generally that it's a shock followed by a recovery. They happen, recessions are irregular in their spacing, they're irregular in their size, and they're usually associated with big external shock events like wars, oil price hikes, and things like that. So that's about as well as I think we can handle the world.
Shall we have one last question? I think you had your hand up earlier.
Can we get him a mic?
Okay, good. Oh, wait, a medic? Wait, purple shirt.
Sorry. No, you're fine. I know you touched on it earlier, but how big of a role do the private markets and trading and trends such as in options play into your forecasting of a possible economic downturn? Because they might be a little bit ahead, like you mentioned earlier.
So I think we're always paying attention to what markets are thinking, especially when it comes to things like, the yield curve, for example, is a market-produced thing, right? It's the result of collecting a bunch of yields at different maturities. That's not something we can very easily control. Central banks have tried in other parts of the world to exercise some control over parts of it, but that's really heavily a market-determined object. So in the end, we pay attention to that. We try to take signal from that. The signal, the unwinding of the market information that we take in is always complicated by the fact that we're a gorilla. So what we do, or what we're expected to do, shows up in market prices as well. So if we look at market prices and conclude from them what markets think, that's not quite right. What you have to do is you have to unravel it from what do they think independently of the things that they think you're going to do. So that's what makes it very hard for us, and makes it very hard in general to extract and coax information from financial markets. We spend a lot of time doing it, but I wanted to point you to this very, this is called sometimes the Hall of Mirrors problem. Like, so you're the financial markets, I'm the central bank. You think I'm going to do something, so you trade on the basis of what you think I'm going to do. I look at your trades and the prices that come out of it and say, oh, here's what markets think. But you're like, no, I'm just doing things because I think you're going to do something in the future. So there's that simultaneity that we always have to guard against, like what part of what we see in the markets represents something that is an expected behavior on our part. And so we do surveys, for instance, to help us understand that. as best we can. Combine that with financial market data. No one thing is kind of enough. Does that help? Yeah.
Maybe one last quick question, whoever that was over there that was going to ask and then didn't. So,
Okay. Thank you.
Short, quick question, JC.
All right, my question is about Keynes. So, according to Keynes theory,
Keynes, you said?
Yep, liquidity preference and the paradox of thrift. That when there is a recession, people are more willing to save money, but in order to spend money instead. And also, according to the paradox of thrift, that not all of the saving will be transferred into investment. So, how today's central bankers solve this problem and read Keynes theory?
So Keynes has ideas that have gotten imported, I think, in ways over time that really focus on some aspects of how he thought markets didn't function well. A really important part of that is that he didn't think prices adjusted very fast. Another part is that he thought in the short run, we've implemented, so Keynesian ideas show up by having markets be subject to imperfections in competition in the short run that are kind of important. That opens the door for some of the things that you're talking about, where if, for example, households decide suddenly that they're nervous, or businesses decide that they're nervous about investing in the future for whatever set of reasons, that can result in them pulling back on activity right now, which can then have some knock-on effects on the economy. So you can think of that as a version of the paradox of thrift, in the sense that people saving in the aggregate leads to a drop in output going forward, as opposed to if that was turned into investment, it could actually lead to more output going forward. So, I think in that sense, the answer to your question is those ideas are alive in modern macroeconomic thinking. Quantitatively, how strong are they? Well, it depends on on the particular case at heart. So that's the way in which Keynes, I think, lives on in it's called New Keynesian economics. In fact, is kind of the way that we think about lots of monetary policy questions. So it's in the name.
All right, thank you very much, Kartik.
Thank you.
Thank you.